Hi, everyone. It's Professor Clark. In this lecture, we are going to learn about a poet who is less famous than Pushkin, but still extremely important, and someone who has been gaining more and more attention in the 20th and 21st centuries. And that is Yevgeny Abramovich Baratynsky. Baratynsky was born into a family of landed gentry from sort of central Russia, and his exact birth date is in question. He was born sometime in late winter or early spring of 1800, but there are actually two name days for Yevgeny then, and the church records show different birth dates for him. So we don't know exactly when he was born. His father, whose portrait you can see there on the left, died young when he was about 10. And so it fell upon his mother to raise the family. Like Pushkin, the young Baratynsky showed a precocious literary talent, and he was sent in his early teens to the prestigious Pages Corps, which was a boarding school in St. Petersburg. However, he was very unhappy there and only lasted a couple of years before getting expelled for forming a quote-unquote society of avengers. He and his friends had been reading a lot of Schiller, and they were inspired by this, and they formed a society of avengers, which mostly engaged in pilfering small amounts of money so that they could buy wine and candy. And they got caught doing this, and he was expelled for it. And because they had the name, the Society of Avengers, he was not only expelled for petty theft, but he was considered to be a kind of a terrorist, and he was stripped of the rights of nobility and told that his only chance to regain his status as a nobleman was to enlist in the army as a private and work his way up to officer status. So this was kind of a big deal for someone who was 16. He was not only expelled, but he was stripped of his noble rank and was originally in sort of semi-house arrest back in his family's country home. And then when he was 18, enlisted in the army as a private and had to hope to be able to work his way up to officer status in order to regain his status as a nobleman. He did enlist in the army when he was in his late teens and was stationed first in St. Petersburg, where he met the young Pushkin, and they palled around for a while before they were both kind of semi-exiled. But that was his entree into the poetic society of the day, and he made friends with Pushkin and the other up-and-coming young poets in St. Petersburg and was listed amongst their number. In the early 1820s, he was stationed/exiled to Finland, which had just become part of the Russian Empire. It had been taken from the Swedish Empire and made part of the Russian Empire as a autonomous Grand Duchy. So it had this sort of special status within the Russian Empire, but they nonetheless stationed a number of troops from Russia on all of these forts that they built along the Russian-Finnish border. The picture there you see on the left is a picture that I took when I went and visited all the forts where he was stationed, because I wrote my dissertation on Baratynsky, and I spent some time in Finland and studied Finnish. He didn't speak any Finnish, but I studied some Finnish. And I visited all the places where he was stationed and took pictures of the landscape around there, because that was when he first really started making a name for himself as a poet. He made a name for himself with his elegies and his sad love poems, but it was particularly his poetry about Finland that drew everyone's attention. And Pushkin in particular was an admirer of his, and they continued to read each other's poetry after they were both sent their separate ways, Pushkin to the Caucasus and Baratynsky to Finland. Pushkin remained a huge admirer of his and called him the Bard of Finland, and that name stuck with him. In 1825, Baratynsky was promoted to officer status after several years of trying, and pretty much as soon as that happened, he retired his commission, returned home, and married the woman he was in love with, Anastasia Lvovna Engelgard. Baratynsky made a big splash in the early 1820s with his love poems and his poetry about Finland, which had all of this beautiful nature imagery that people really liked. And one of the things that I was trying to capture in the picture on the previous slide was the midnight sun that he wrote a lot about. And that picture that I shared there was taken basically at midnight. And he wrote all about this, midnight sun and the fact that you can't tell the difference between the sky and the sea and where the sun is. And there's this kind of, mix up that happens in these far northern lands. And so already he was showing these metaphysical themes in his early poetry. In his later poetry, he focused more and more on metaphysics, and he was also very interested in German Romantic philosophy. And this featured more and more in his poetry. Perhaps unsurprisingly, his poetry lost a lot of its original popularity, and many people thought that he was a washed-up has-been. Pushkin, however, remained a big fan and said that Baratynsky is unique amongst us, for he thinks. He also said that he would be unique anywhere because of the clear and unique way that he thinks. And Baratynsky became known as the poet of thought for his focus on metaphysics and specifically on his sort of meditations on thought and thinking and its interaction with feeling and life and happiness. And he continued writing even though he did not gain fame and fortune from it in his later years. And he made a number of interesting innovations in Russian poetry and Russian literature in general. His 1842 collection Sumerki, or Twilight or Dusk, was the first poetry collection published in Russia that was organized around a unifying theme. And that unifying theme was this concept of twilight or dusk. And this was something that no one had ever done before in Russia, but he did it. He also experimented with genres such as dystopian science fiction. He was one of the first people to write dystopian science fiction. He also experimented with this sort of fantasy writing, and he has this short story called The Ring that has a lot of similar themes to the Lord of the Rings in it, which is really interesting. Tolkien almost certainly did not read this story, so I don't think there's any connection that way. And they both, I think, because I wrote a paper on this, are looking back to Plato and classical Greek themes. But nonetheless, it's really interesting that his work really prefigured a lot of things that would become important in the 20th century, like these collections written around a unifying theme, or dystopian science fiction, or, fantasy, things like that. He was writing this kind of stuff way before it was cool, and people of his generation thought that he was kind of crazy and had lost his touch. But he was rediscovered by the symbolists in the early 20th century, and he is now considered to be one of Russia's most important metaphysical poets, or even just one of Russia's most important poets. Unfortunately, he didn't live a very long life either. He did not die in a duel, which is unusual, but he collapsed and died unexpectedly in 1844 while on a family trip to Italy. So he also died fairly young, probably of something related to heart disease. His father had also collapsed and died unexpectedly at an early age. And in his later works from his late 30s and early 40s, Baratynsky frequently mentions shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, a choking sensation, which to me suggests that he was already having heart problems and his heart just gave out while he was in Italy. So that is Baratynsky. He is one of what's called the Pushkin Pleiad, which is this collection of, other brilliant stars around Pushkin. And he probably kind of invented the term or suggested it because in the dedication to Sumerki, he dedicated it to Prince Vyazemsky, who was a fellow poet who was a friend of both him and Pushkin. And he calls him a star of a dismembered Pleiad. And this is probably one of the places that we get the idea of the Pushkin Pleiad from. And so he marked Russian poetry and Russian literature in many ways, although at the time he was felt to be passé by many of his generation, and he himself felt like he was misunderstood and was not in the right generation and the right time, and people didn't get what he was trying to do. 100 years later was when people really started to get what he was trying to do. So I feel it's really important that we read him. It is likely that you will not appreciate him properly because he is very difficult to read, especially for non-native speakers. He uses a lot of Old Church Slavonic and has a very challenging style a lot of the time. He doesn't have Pushkin's sparkling lightness in his verse. His verse is much more serious and heavy, and it is very compact. He crams a huge amount of meaning into his verse, which can really challenge the reader. So don't be discouraged by that. Understand that he's difficult to read, but also understand that he was really ahead of his time and was doing all kinds of stuff that 100 years later would turn out to be really important.